That is not the way to go. I would quote John Stuart Mill that, a system of state education is merely a great contrivance for trying to make people as alike as possible.
Got into a frame of mind where everything should be privatized and public is bad, partly, I might add, because public has very often been badly run.
Hello, my name is Donald. I'm filling in for Petrus, who's currently trying to escape from Kabul, holding on to an airplane. This is WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. In today's debate, we will be focusing on socialism versus libertarianism. Is socialism hamstringing the working class? Is libertarianism a way for the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer? Joining me to discuss and debate this is Lord Peter Hain, a Labour Party politician and British anti-apartheid activist, who recently released a new book, A Pretoria Boy, the story of South Africa's public enemy number one. He will be taking the so-called socialist side. For the libertarian side, we have Dr. Stephen Davies. He is a historian and the head of education at the IEA. He has released two books, The Economics of Brexit and The Streetwise Guide to the Devil and His Works. Now, Doctor, I made a mistake in the previous debate I hosted, Communism versus Capitalism, with Davies and Rob Davies, that I didn't ask the two to lay out their ideas clearly in the beginning, to lay out the groundwork. And that led to the two arguing past each other because they didn't really understand what the other guy stood for. So to avoid them making the same mistake, let us now assume you are Prime Minister Stephen Davies. You have you won with a super landslide. You control all the seats in Parliament. It doesn't matter what you do, people will keep voting for you. How would you reconfigure the state? Would you bring it back to pre-First World War levels?
Well, actually, I should start off by saying that I really hope that neither I nor anybody else was ever in that position, because that would actually run counter to the core thing that I believe, which is the enormous danger of power generally in human relations, and political power in particular, and concentrated political power in the most highest case of all. So in a way, that's the wrong question to ask, because if I were in that kind of position, yes, I would be looking to, I would rephrase it slightly differently, dramatically reduce the scope of politics or collective decision-making. But I'm also wise enough to know that that's very difficult to do, and that revolutionary politics, which is what I think that your question implies, is actually a really bad way to bring about any kind of change, in my view. History, and particularly recent history, gives us ample evidence of that. So what I would start by saying is that really the core or central belief that I have, which is a starting point for how I would approach that kind of scenario that you describe, is that fundamentally in a political community, we're all making decisions all the time about what to do, how to utilize resources, how to live together. And there are two ways in which those decisions are made. Many of them are made privately, if you will, by individuals or by households or by voluntary associations. So they're a collective decision in that case, but made by a voluntary collectivity. These are then, if you like, aggregated through spontaneous social processes, of which markets are only one, although obviously one of the important ones. Now, by contrast, there are some decisions that we make in such a community through a collective decision-making process, the political process. And in those kinds of decisions, the minority are bound by the decision of the majority. In a democratic system, that is. It may be that we have a political process like China, where it's a small minority that makes a decision, or even one man, Xi Jinping. But we're receiving here a democratic system in which collective decisions of that sort are made through a collective decision-making process, voting, debates in Parliament, and all the rest of it. Now, I'm not an anarchist, so I do think that there is a certain range of things that need to be decided upon in that way, where the political community as a whole has to act as a whole through a collective decision-making process. But what I want to do is to have that area as small as possible, really. this is not the same as saying, talking about the size of GDP controlled by government. It's perfectly possible to have a government that actually does a lot where the scope of political decision-making is wide, but which doesn't spend a lot of money. That's perfectly possible. Singapore is an example of this, for instance. On the other hand, you could also have what is probably the worst of both worlds, where you have a government that doesn't do a lot or does it very badly, but also spends a ton of money. Now, that is a really dreadful state of affairs to be in. I suspect that's in some ways where we are in contemporary Britain, actually. And so what I would like to do is to, if you like, move a whole lot of things out of the collective decision-making process into the private decision-making process, while leaving behind a number of core things, which I think it does make sense for either efficiency reasons or other reasons to do collectively. Public health, for example, which we've obviously just had, would be an example of one of the things that has to be done collectively in that way for various reasons to do with the nature of the phenomenon. So that's ultimately what I do. And so in a way, the obvious paradox, and I'm sure Peter Hain will sort of bring this up, is that if I'm engaging in politics or interested in politics, then I'm trying to use a process that I want to reduce to bring about the reduction. And there's something inherently paradoxical about that, I think. And I think that's a fair criticism of my position. But as will probably emerge later on in the conversation, I do have, if you like, not exactly a way around that, but I do have a response to that criticism. So that's my position, basically, ultimately.
Okay, so Peter, same question, and of course you can reply to the doctor's statement.
Well, Donald, hi, and also to Stephen. Look, I start off with the position that we're stronger together than we are apart. And I reject entirely Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister's view that there is no such thing as society. That phrase was expressing an extreme libertarian point of view that I don't know whether Stephen really agrees with. It doesn't seem to me that he does, from what he said. In other words, that there are things that are better done collectively rather than individually, that there are a range of public functions that we're all stronger together if we do them collectively, like provide, as we do under the National Health Service, collective health provision. I think it's become very clear with an aging society that should also be extended to social care, because at the present time you have an extreme privatized system of social care where if you fall seriously ill, either physically or mentally, then it's up to you to provide very, very expensive social care on your own. Now, only a proportion of us are going to ever be in that situation, just as only a proportion of us are going to ever need really intensive healthcare. So I think that the National Health Service principle should be extended to social care as well. And there's a growing demand within Britain, and I think collectively, to move to at least a Scandinavian type model where, yes, we have to pay higher taxation, all of us, in order to provide better common services, health services, social care, especially for elderly and vulnerable citizens, and that extends to education. I'm not a believer in private education. I think it should be, because it's private education only ever applies to a minority. It should be provided for everybody. And then what you achieve within that system should depend on the hard work and the ability and the opportunities that you get. Now, alongside this is a very important choice between, if you like, a libertarian neoliberal type state and a state that I believe in, which is one that provides fundamental services and in which the government and the state provides fundamental support for all of us and for business as well. If you look at the post-Second World War era, you had a period from the Second World War up until round about the 1980s, symbolized by Margaret Thatcher coming to power in around 1980 and Ronald Reagan in America the same. Up until that period, you had a system of Keynesian economic management, demand management, where there was public investment and there was also encouragement of private enterprise. And there was much better growth in that period than there has been since then, in which you've seen much lower levels of growth, much bigger levels of inequality, not just between those at the very top and those at the very bottom, but actually the top 10% under this neoliberal economic regime, which has dominated societies globally, in Britain, in South Africa, and more widely, in which you've seen the top 10% do very well, the rest of the 90% do either badly or simply stagnate. The top 1% do extraordinarily well, and the top 0.1% go stratospherically out of sight well. Now, that is not a sustainable society, and that's why you've seen rises in populism and economic dislocations, including Brexit and Donald Trump and so on. So, to summarize, I think that a much more Keynesian approach to economic demand management, where the role of the state and government is important, where not everything public is bad and not everything private is good, which has been the norm for the last decade in particular and the last few decades, but we have a sensible balance between the two, and we need to get back to that.
Well, that's a very insightful opinion, and but that's a lot to unpack. But perhaps to focus just on one issue, education, which I think is the doctor's speciality. Does education need to remain under the control of the state?
Actually, it's not my speciality. It's an area about which I, have ideas and I've studied historically, but it's not my speciality. It's just that I run the Institute of Economic Affairs Educational Outreach. I don't think it needs to remain part of the state. Let me say that, before I explain why I think that I both agree and disagree with what Lord Hain has said, with what Peter Hain has just said. First of all, he says at the end, we've had a kind of libertarian stroke neoliberal state. Well, I don't recognize the kind of state we have anywhere in the world, actually, certainly not in Great Britain, as being libertarian, because in terms of the size and extent of government, it's actually grown since Thatcher. We're now spending an extremely high proportion of GDP, and this was even before the pandemic came along. And also, in terms of things like civil liberties, I think the Thatcher years are actually very bad. There was quite an extension of state power under the Thatcher government, which has in fact been extended since under the Labour government that Peter Hain served in. Now, I do think you might call it a neoliberal state, but that's a different issue about what that term actually means. And I think it means a particular approach to economic management, which actually I don't share, a kind of technocratic, supposedly free market approach, which I think is actually more about a certain kind of, technocratic economic expertise, which I actually disagree with. I think that in terms of like what you said at the end there about the, increase in wealth inequality and it's income inequality, actually, I should say, not wealth inequality, that's taken place recently. I agree with them, this is unsustainable, but I ultimately blame this upon the deranged monetary policy that's been followed really since at least the 1990s or probably even before then. And I think that's one of the ways this is fed through into both wealth and income inequality. Now, in terms of things, though, about what he said at the start, I agree with him that we are better off doing things together. I'm not a kind of Max Stirner-style, totally egoist individualist. I do think there are all kinds of things that are done better collectively. What doesn't follow from that is that they should therefore be done by government. That only makes sense if you think that the activity in question is best done as a monopoly, if you will, or as a single universal service. And I actually think that certainly in education, and I would argue in actually a whole range of other things as well, that is not the way to go. I would quote John Stuart Mill that, a system of state education is merely a great contrivance for trying to make people as alike as possible. Now, Mill thought that there should be an obligation enforced by the state that people educate their children, and I agree completely with him and his arguments on that. But it doesn't follow from that if you want to have universal education collectively provided, that it has to be done by government. It can be done by a whole number of other means. And part of the problem, I think, at the moment is we have got ourselves stuck into a mindset where we think there are only really two alternatives: profit-seeking private corporations or government. And actually, those are only two of a range of options. There are lots and lots of other ways in which a service like education can be provided, if you like, through voluntary associations, non-profit making bodies, a whole range of things like that. And I'm a strong believer in educational pluralism. Now, the state might have a role to play in terms of encouraging this or compelling parents to educate their children up to a certain level. I think that's fair enough for obvious reasons. But there are many, many different ways you can do this, many different styles of education, formats of education. And so I'm a believer in having the 100 flowers bloom, as somebody once said, and 100 schools or literal schools of thought contend. So I don't think you do want to have the state doing this. You know, at the very most, you would have a kind of residual function for government, in my view, which is to pick up the gaps if there are any failures. But personally, I doubt there would be. I think the evidence from other parts of the world is that actually you will get pretty close to 100% provision of education through private means.
Peter?
Well, on education, I think I completely disagree with Stephen on that. I think it's incumbent. Look, education is so important. Your life chances, children's opportunities are determined by the skills you have and the basic education you get from, frankly, your parents reading to you all the way through primary school education, nursery school education, pre-nursery school education, all the way up. And I think the only way to achieve that, and the evidence is pretty conclusive on this, it seems to me, to provide everybody as opposed to simply a minority with that opportunity, is to provide it publicly. Now, I'm quite happy that you get different forms of educational opportunity, different schools, systems that are provided on a voluntary basis. But what I will not agree to is that you shrink the state and you shrink government to such an extent that it cannot provide school opportunities from very early on. And the evidence shows that the earlier you get the chance to go to some form of educational opportunity, ideally at preschool level and at nursery level, and certainly at primary school level, at least in the British concept of the term, going on to high school, secondary, to use the British term, school level, that is the way that you give everybody the opportunity to advance. Now, I just don't think that can be provided publicly. We've gone through a phase. It started under our Labour government, and it's been accelerated under the Conservative government since 2010 of academy schools and so-called free schools, and more, although they're state funded, but they are privately run. And actually that hasn't provided more educational opportunities. Some have failed badly, some have succeeded, but then some schools under the public school provision, I say publicly, I mean publicly provided. There's this odd thing in Britain that Stephen will know, that yes, private schools are actually called public schools, which is something I found very difficult to get my head around as a 16-year-old when I arrived into exile in Britain from the apartheid struggle that my parents had waged in Pretoria in the late 50s and 1960s. So I'm a firm believer in the government providing opportunity for all, but then decentralizing, because I'm not a state socialist. I am, and I've always called myself this, I've always called myself a libertarian socialist. I don't believe in the state running everything. I don't believe in nationalization and state control of our economy. I don't think that works. I'm a libertarian socialist, you know, in a nutshell. Industrial democracy, employees running their own enterprises rather than the state running enterprises, as in the old Soviet model. So I'm a very firm believer that education and health is the two of the most basic needs that all of us depend upon to have any kind of decent standard of life. And then you can go well beyond that, but that needs to be publicly underpinned. And I just make one other point, and it's to emphasize something I said earlier. We've got into this mindset where low taxation and apparently, liberating individuals to go out and create this wonderful society is become the absolute religious mantra. That doesn't work. I don't believe in very high punitive forms of taxation, the kind of 97% that applied in Britain to very, very wealthy people. I do think entrepreneurs and risk takers need to be rewarded, but I also think we have to be, all of us, to be prepared to pay more than we have been doing these past few decades to provide the essential services upon which our standard of living and our security depends. If you run down the state to such an extent that you can't fund police officers properly, then our own system of security is damaged, and then our own liberty, if you like, libertarian spirit, is impossible to achieve, and that goes for a number of other things, including, above all, health and education. And just one final example: if you look at the COVID experience, and I speak as somebody who in the House of Lords has sat on a specialist committee looking at the pandemic, and I'm not talking about how it's been handled and so forth, which I think has been largely very badly in Britain, apart from vaccination. What you've seen is massive increases in inequality. A lot of children forced to learn from home haven't had laptops or iPads, haven't even had proper broadband, haven't had the space in their homes free from the rest of their families to focus in the way that they would in the classroom to learn. So that's raised the issue about whether there should be free broadband online access for everybody. Now, that can only be provided publicly. It can't be provided privately. Whether you need, in addition, to look at housing. We've got a massive housing shortage in Britain, and that hasn't been solved by the market. It hasn't been solved by the small state or people buying their own houses and providing for their own housing on their own. So I think, funny enough, COVID has brought into sharp relief this debate as to whether you need a small state or whether you need a decently afforded state, which also gives every individual the opportunity to do their own thing and to realize their own potential.
Can I respond to that actually directly?
Sure.
A couple of things there. I think that in a way, the kind of thing that Peter Hain wants, this kind of libertarian socialist, decentralized and pluralistic model of state education, in a way is something I would much prefer that to the system we've got, quite frankly, which is ridiculously centralized. But despite all the way in which, in theory, you have these academy schools and other things, it's still controlled to a phenomenal degree by the Department for Education.
Stephen's right about that.
Yes, indeed. The thing is, I think that the system, if you fund everything by the government through the taxation mechanism, I think it's very, very hard to resist the logic of politics, which is to make it uniform, particularly in a unitary state such as Britain. That may be a function of the nature of the British state, that we've got a unitary state. Now, in a way, I accept the argument that Peter Hain made at the start there, because in a way that's the argument Mill was making, that the reason why you should compel parents to educate their children is that their life chances are so determined by it that to allow negligent or incompetent parents to not have their children educated would be to impose enormous and unjust costs on them. And I also agree that the case for state education is stronger at the primary or even nursery level than it is later on, because there's overwhelming evidence that educational disadvantage is pretty much set in stone by the time you get to about 4 or 5. It's very difficult to reverse it after that. So early intervention is the way to go, I think. So, you know, if you were to really push me, I would say that actually that end of the educational experience is where I'm most happy with, you know, pretty significant state action. But the question is this: the argument that I think Lord Hain is making throughout this piece, his remarks there, is that if something needs to be provided collectively, it needs to be provided universally. I won't necessarily disagree with that in many cases. But then secondly, that the only way to get the universality is through the government providing it. That if you let it be done by the market, then what you may have is maybe let's say for the sake of argument, 90% get the service provided privately, but that still leaves 10% who don't, and this is, you know, unacceptable for various reasons. Now, the question, that's an empirical question. It's not clear that this is true. Take, for example, clothing and shoes. Now, you could argue that having shoes is a kind of necessity for leading a decent life. And at one time, there were lots of people who didn't have that access to shoes. There were, you know, there's the famous pictures you'll see of street urchins in 19th century, you know, London without any shoes. But actually now we do have that, and that's been done purely by private market mechanisms. So I think it's actually an empirical question as to whether or not in a particular area you do in fact need government to achieve what you might call 100% coverage, if you will. Now, I think in the area of public health, and I think the pandemic has shown this very clearly, I think, yes, you do need it. And I think that is one of the areas where I would definitely have government do things, and where, you know, it's been a government responsibility since the time of the ancient Sumerians. You know, the Romans had an amazing public health system, for example. So that area, I think, is, on the other hand, medical treatment, if you will, that it's not so clear to me that you need direct state funding to achieve universal coverage in that regard.
Stephen, may I just ask you a question? Sorry, there's quite a lot of common ground here, which is interesting. The public health, do you mean decent sanitation?
Yes, I do. Yeah, vaccination as well. Yeah, prophylactic measures against, and obviously in the current context, control of epidemics and attempts to manage, you know, or prevent epidemics, you know, and pandemics in particular. So I think it's amazing. What I would add to that finally is that you mentioned that we haven't got enough police officers and so on. And one of the things I think that has happened is that in the last 10 years, what I would call the core functions of government, which even as a small state libertarian would strongly support, such as the criminal justice system and things of that sort, these have actually experienced pretty dramatic cuts, whereas other areas, which I would not see as being a function of government, have actually not experienced such cuts. They've experienced either nil growth or modest growth. Now, that's an extraordinary situation. That's why I said at the start that I think we may well be getting into the situation where we have a government that's actually in many ways not doing what it should be doing, but still spending a ton of money, which is the worst of all possible worlds to be in, really.
Yeah, Peter, it seems like there's a lot of common ground here, and specifically when Doctor says that if you take clothing, for example, it's a sector where the private sector does very well. Why can't you extend that to the other sectors in the state as well?
Well, I don't think the state can buy your shoes or choose your underpants or that kind of thing. But that then raises the whole issue about, you know, minimum wages and decent standards of living, decent standards of pensions. I haven't seen any society which has solved the pensions question. And South Africa, where you're speaking from, Donald, is a young society. We're an old society in Britain, and Europe's an old society, so is America, but there's a lot of young societies. But South Africa will become an old society.
Hopefully.
Generations to come. And so will much of the world as economic progress is made and people's lifespans increase. So I think there's a balance to be struck between what should government provide and what should be left for citizens to sort out themselves. And that's the really interesting debate. Now, my argument is that certainly since, round about 1980, that the obsession has been with shrinking with a small state, with shrinking the state and shrinking government provision. Now, in South Africa, where you have, 900 state-owned enterprises, which is a ridiculously high number, a lot of things that should be in the private sector, like mining and so on, in the public sector, and actually taking taxpayers' money away from doing the things that taxpayers' money should do, that Stephen and I might agree on, though we might disagree on the level and proportion, like basic education, basic health, basic housing provision, basic pension provision, and so on. I think that the balance we've got into, and I touched upon this in my opening remarks, we've got into a frame of mind where everything should be privatized and public is bad, partly, I might add, because public has very often been badly run. And this brings me to a point which we haven't so touched upon, though Stephen did tangentially refer to it, I think, which is, should government be as centralized as it is? England has a very centralized system, and Britain's state historically has been very centralized. We've had devolution, which started off under the Labour government, in which I was proud to serve from 1997 onwards, for Scotland and Wales, and for Northern Ireland, which is in a special position given us. But we've not had that for England. We've had, and I think decisions are better made locally and regionally, and in South African terms, provincially, than they are made by the entire, by Whitehall and civil servants sitting in Whitehall determining everything. And Stephen made a very valid point about academy schools, which would not be a familiar model to a South African audience. But actually, they're all run ultimately by the Department of Education in London, as opposed to by local authorities, locally elected, where you have your local councillors. The South African term would be municipal government, I guess, or city government, running the school system and the college system. So, and I think that's a very bad model. I'm very much in favor of decentralizing power and decision-making to head teachers, to school governors, to municipal and local government, to regional government, and so on. And in England, apart from London and a few mayors, like, the Manchester region and so on, we have a very centralized system of government. And I think that's a bad system.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is definitely an area which we agree on. But having said that, I think almost anyone of common sense knows that the British government is just too strongly centralized. It's just that if you're in politics, it's extremely tempting to keep it that way, because you hope to be in charge of everything by winning an election, which is a very bad incentive to have, I think. I mean, I think in a way, I thought that the way that Peter Hain put that actually a moment ago was what I said at the start, which is that the real question is, what are the areas of life that we want to leave in private and voluntary collective action? What are the areas that we want to have in state action? And ultimately, I think this is an empirical question. So I would argue, for example, he mentioned housing, and I would argue that that's actually an area where we should be able to have it done entirely by the private sector. We did for a long time. The problem is we have two problems, really, I think, not just in Britain, but many others. One is the land, peculiarly in Britain, is the land planning laws, which means that we have a chronic failure of house supply. We just don't build enough houses, either public or private, because of the land planning laws, plus the controls on local government. So that's one problem, which is basically stopping private action from doing what it can and should do. The other is more difficult, I have to admit, and that is that in major metropolitan cities all over the world, the housing market has become disconnected from the local economy because of very large flows of hot money. And that's, you can see this in Auckland, for example, in New Zealand, or in many other major cities around the world.
London's a classic case.
Yeah, the classic example. And I think that's down to the deranged monetary policy that I mentioned earlier on. So that's a much more difficult challenge to solve, I think. But again, it doesn't lead to the idea that you could resolve this problem through the state. So that's a case where I would go on the side of, having private action do it, and I wouldn't have the government involved in that sector. So that's what the argument is ultimately. It's about exactly where you draw that line. And also then, if you are going to have a government doing things, what kind of government it should be, which is where for some things you definitely want it to be centralized, like the military, but for other things you definitely don't want it to be centralized.
The issue of housing is an interesting one. You know, we have a chronic housing shortage in Britain. The market has failed to solve that. In other words, the private sector has not solved that. And the last 10, 11 years of conservative governments have made it worse. Actually, I think you have to look at the post-Second World War model, which began under a Labour government and continued under Conservative government for most of the time. I regret, but it did. And there was a consensus that you had to build, especially after a war-shattered economy and housing sector. It was only public provision that could build the necessary scale of housing at an affordable kind for people, mostly to rent. But then the mistake, and I think we're back in that situation now. But with this proviso, where there might be common ground between Stephen and I as well, I'm sure, even if you don't agree, Stephen, that it should be publicly provided. I don't see how you solve the problem either. Otherwise, it hasn't been solved in Britain. Otherwise, but what the mistake made by the state, mostly under the Conservatives, but under Labour as well, including Labour-run municipal local government, was that the state had to micromanage everything, including the colour of your front door. So that people in council, in municipal housing, who rented that housing and gave people the opportunity to make their way in the world, and they would never have been able to under a fully privatized sector and hadn't done, that they didn't have any sense of power over their own lives. And that created a much more alienated system of living, and it didn't actually empower people, and it didn't give them more control over their own lives. And because with power and control comes responsibility. You know, I think though the statists who want everything run from the center have never answered the question as to how you give people more influence over their own lives, but also more responsibility that comes with that influence. If you provide everything from the center, people think it's all provided for them, and therefore they don't have any responsibility to look after their gardens, if they have gardens, or to look after their you know, their balconies or their stairs or the appearance of their block of apartments or flats. So I'm a believer in public provision, much more of it, in housing as well as the other sectors I've described, health, social care, and education being the main ones. But giving, in the case of privately rented tenants, much more say and responsibility for managing their own properties.
Well, I mean, this is interesting because I'd like to actually respond to that, and it's a dialogue, if you like, because Peter Hain says that the private sector has failed to meet the demand. And my answer to that is partly that it's hogtied, and it's hogtied by the Town and Country Planning Act, and particularly the way the courts in turn have interpreted and developed it since in decisions since the 1970s, which makes it incredibly difficult to develop land. We also have things like the green belts and other restrictions as well, which also make it difficult in certain specific parts of the country. And I think if you look at the actual production of housing units after World War II, it's true. There is enormous provision, both public and private, during the 1950s and 60s, but then both kinds of housing start to decline at the end of the 60s. And I think the simple reason was, putting it very sort of like stereotypically, we ran out of bomb sites, basically. We ran out of all the land in urban areas that had been produced by both you know, involuntary slum clearance by the Luftwaffe, you might say, and also slum clearance by local authorities after the war. But now it's become very, very difficult. Now, the question is, let's suppose you do have state provision. What you said was that the state made mistakes in terms of micromanagement. That wasn't the only error. I think the other error, in many ways, was the change in housing design policy that took place in the early 1960s under the Macmillan government, where you got a movement towards a whole series of modish council house and estate design policies, which had disastrous sociological results, things like deck access flats. And I lived in Manchester for 30 years, and I vividly remember things like the Hume Crescents, which actually got a RIBA gold medal, no less. And this was a big housing development in central Manchester, which was completely uninhabitable, basically. They eventually had to knock the whole thing down even before they'd paid off the cost of building it. The problem is that shows the big problem with the state supply of things like this, which is that if the people making the decisions get it wrong, and in this case allowed themselves to be, I think, led by the nose by the architectural profession, they get it wrong across the board. And you find that the effects and the consequences of an error are much, much more extensive. Now, the other thing I would say is that this is an area where, you know, I think it's a mistake to think that the only alternative is things like Taylor Wimpey or the government through local authorities, presumably, or housing associations. I think actually what we need and what we should have been doing in terms of reforming public housing is moving towards things like housing cooperatives, self-build schemes and things of this sort. In other words, private provision, but not necessarily done through profit-making organizations, because I think that kind of much more decentralized area, which could draw upon the kind of new developments in finance that have taken place, would be the way to address the problem we undoubtedly have. As I say, there is an additional problem in certain parts of the country, which is to do with global monetary conditions, which requires a different set of measures, I think, some of which I would regret, but I'm beginning to think they probably will be necessary. But that's another issue, as I say. But that's what I would say in response to that.
You mentioned earlier, Stephen, and the problem in Britain's a very congested country.
Yeah.
Unlike South Africa, which is a vast country of openness, and therefore you've got a much better opportunity to find the space. And land is very expensive in Britain. You know, land is the real problem. It's not so much the cost of housing, of building the housing, it's actually the cost of land that it sits on, which is astronomically and disproportionately high, partly because we're a small society, and also partly because, and you make a fair point about, you know, we ran out of bomb sites up to a point, but, you know, there is a lot of land and has been still in public provision. You know, alongside the railways and so forth. And there's also a lot in a deindustrialized society, which we've become, and a lot of societies are becoming. There's a lot of derelict land that is sitting there, and land banking takes place, and private developers sit on it because they hope the value will increase. I think there's a case for the state going in and saying, you know, we're buying this land at the price we determine, in order to have affordable housing built on it. And that doesn't need to be necessarily built by the state, as long as it's affordable rents or affordable for people to buy. So I think, you know, state intervention, not the big brother state, but government intervention from the center to the local and the regional and the provincial, or whatever the descriptions are, but I think we know what we're talking about. I think is vital, and that then brings me on to the economy. But I don't think that the economy should be run by the state. I think the state's function is to provide the infrastructure, the public services, and the skills and the environment in which risk-taking entrepreneurs can survive. But with this important qualification, and I'm a follower of, I probably haven't got her name correctly pronounced, but of Marina Mazzucato's Entrepreneurial State, as the book that she's written describes it, in which you have a state that is supporting and providing a creative environment for the private sector, but is also doing the investment that the private sector won't do on its own. And I give an example of our ability to communicate now online. The internet, my Apple iPhone, and Siri and all of these associated technologies that we now take for granted, at least as an iPhone user, and there are probably other descriptions for other forms of smartphones. The original technology was invented under primarily American defense budget expenditure, state research and development budget funding, and yet it required Apple to bring the iPhone to market. Government could never have brought the iPhone to market. So we need a balance here between an entrepreneurial state, and this goes beyond just iPhone or online technology, much more broadly in society, as we face the challenges of robotics and AI, artificial intelligence, and so on, which could cause massive job losses if we don't get that right. And that's where I think government has to be seen as a partner with private enterprise and private entrepreneurialism and private initiative and invention and innovation, which governments are not very good at, innovating or inventing things, but they are good at providing the seed corn funding for that very innovation to occur and that very research and development to be initiated.
If I could just quickly ask Peter, why is statism so popular among left-wing circles? What is the main reason why they motivate us? Because I asked Rob Davies the same question: why can't we decentralize powers? And he was adamant against it. He's a member of the South African Communist Party. Why? What is the main reason why they give? Why everything has to be centralized under the control of the state?
Well, there's a difference, and this is implicit in everything I've said so far, Donald. There's a difference between public provision, which can only be funded by public taxation and provided publicly, and I've described the kind of the sort of picture that I think that is necessary for, and then running everything. And I haven't had this debate with Rob, who's a friend and I know and respect, but I've never been a communist and I've never been a state socialist. I've always been, since my late teens when my ideas were formed, a libertarian socialist. So I don't think it's a good idea.
If you talk to Labour politicians who support this, what reason do they give for this?
Well, simply because, as I've said throughout so far, there are many, many things that only the state can provide properly, that gives everybody a chance to have an opportunity. Why did we invent the National Health Service under a Labour government following the Second World War? Because the system of health provision was extremely unequal, extremely unfair, and actually very bad for public health. And that goes for housing, and it went for education as well. That's why you need the state to provide that. But you don't have to have it run from Pretoria or London or Beijing or Berlin or Washington.
Could I answer that question, actually? I think I have a kind of historian's, being a historian myself, take on that, because the National Health Service is an interesting case in point, because there were big debates in the cabinet at the time about exactly what to do when they set up the National Health Service, because Herbert Morrison in particular, but other members of the cabinet as well, were of the opinion that the government should take over funding health and ultimately kind of control it through directions, but that the actual provision, the hospitals and clinics and the rest of it, should still remain in the hands of local government, charitable organizations and the like. And there was a huge argument in the cabinet between Herbert Morrison on the one hand and Aaron Bevan on the other hand, who obviously won the argument, which was for the government to take over the hospitals and for it all to be directly controlled by the Secretary of State for Health himself, in other words. And I think the reason why he argued that was because he wanted to make the administration of those, the good reason he had was he wanted to make the administration of those hospitals publicly accountable. And his famous thing was, I want a dropped bedpan in a hospital to echo through the corridors of Whitehall. His thinking was that if he, as the minister, and an office in Whitehall was responsible for running all the hospitals, it would give them public accountability. Now, I'm afraid, I think actually he was completely wrong about that, and Herbert Morrison was completely right. But if that wasn't what they wanted to do, Clement Attlee eventually broke the deadlock by coming down on Bevan's side. So that's the reason. I think the good reason, the good motives for politicians wanting state control is the fact that they want to get something done, and they think that the most efficacious and quickest way of getting it done is to give the central government a lot of directive, strong power to do it. And the other thing also in Britain is, I'm afraid, whenever you suggest the kind of decentralized libertarian government that Peter Hain wants, you get people complaining about a postcode lottery. And there is this idea that not only do you want universality, that you also want uniformity. And my own view is, well, the uniformity is less valuable than many people think, because you're not going, if you get experimentation and local variation and local control, you're going to get a postcode lottery. It's the nature of the beast. So I think that...
But Stephen, we may or may not agree on this. I'd just like to probe a bit. The distinction between uniformity and universality, I'm in favor of universal provision, but I'm not in favor of uniform delivery.
That's exactly, that would be my view as well, yes. So, yeah.
In other words, you've got to have universal pension provision. You've got to have universal rights to access to schools and access to education and rights to healthcare, and I hope social care, especially for elderly and vulnerable citizens as well. But it doesn't have to be delivered all from London. It can be delivered, and it can be delivered creatively, and with budgets decentralized, it could be delivered more efficiently in certain places, providing examples and models for others. So in that sense, I'm a believer in much more creative control at a local level, but accountability and minimum standards. Because the problem is, if you just decentralize and you don't provide decent minimum standards, then certain areas and regions will fall behind.
Well, I think actually, I mean, the way we used to run government in Britain before the 1920s had a way of addressing that, which was that you had local authorities delivering most of the services, but often on a profitable basis, interestingly, but you had national inspectorates who maintained minimum standards. That was the standard that was done in education, in hospitals, health through the Board of Health and various other things. And we've moved away from that steadily since the 1920s. So that sounds like the kind of thing you'd want there, really. Obviously, there are practical difficulties in doing it, but that's not a matter. But if you think about the private area, that's what you get. Nobody expects that private provision, non-public provision of anything, is going to be uniform. The whole point is that it's highly varied and responsive to different forms of demand. The question is, how far do you take that principle? I would take it further than you would, I imagine, or clearly. But I think that's the question. The question is, where do we draw that line between one kind of provision and the other?
Yeah, and an interesting, just to extend your question, an interesting example, which perhaps falls more and more on your side of the argument, but I think I honestly have to concede, is we had a situation of waste provision and services for collecting your waste and removing it and recycling it and so on, although not much recycling was done in that era, which was all provided by the local state. And it was actually pretty inefficient. It got to be local trade unions, and I'm a trade unionist and proud to be, got into the position of a comfortable, self-interested, inefficient provision that actually wasn't clearing people's dustbins effectively, and resulted in enormous confrontations and anger locally. And it was all privatized and outsourced. And the cost reduced, but the conditions for the workers also undermined. And so somewhere between that original statist model that fell into disrepute in Britain and what then became kind of a bit of a free-for-all, although I think it's kind of leveled out a bit since, so nobody's arguing that all waste disposal should be brought back under certainly central, but even local state delivery, as opposed to, tendering to actually deliver it. So I think there's been a kind of balance found on that. And waste disposal is essential for all of us. It's a fundamental social public provision, but it doesn't have to be delivered according to the model that followed from the Second World War right up to the 1980s.
Yeah, Doctor, you can obviously reply, but I see we're running out of time. So if you can just also your last words and your concluding statements. Yeah, please.
Oh, okay. I mean, what I would say is, I think this has been a very fruitful debate because it clarifies, I think, what for anybody watching this is the main issue, which is where you draw the line between collective provision, which involves the use of the taxation power of government, because that's what we're talking about here. The power that governments have uniquely, because no private entity has this in a law-abiding society, to collect revenue through the tax system, ultimately using force, in order to meet collective needs. So what is the balance you strike between meeting collective needs that way and meeting collective needs through decentralized private action, which includes voluntary collective action of various kinds? Now, I think this is there are some kind of events where you can things where you can clearly say they're in one category or the other. In between, there's a kind of contested category, and so the question is, where would you draw that boundary? Where would you draw that frontier? I'm not a complete free market anarchist, so I think that's a fantasy, quite frankly. So I'm not of the opinion that you can simply eliminate collective and ultimately tax-based collective provision entirely. On the other hand, I do think that we've got a lot too much of it at the moment. And what we have right now, I mean, I am a bit bemused by the idea that we've been trying to shrink the state, because if people have been trying to shrink the state in Britain over the last 50 years, they've made a really bad job of it, I have to say, by most metrics. As I say, we may have ended up with the worst of both worlds, actually, which is an ineffectual state, which is still very, very expensive. But the point is that at the moment, I think there are quite a number of areas where government is doing, things it really shouldn't be doing. Whereas on the other hand, I think there are some things government should be doing, which is not doing well, basically. The provision of policing services, for example, being one of them in the current situation. So I think that's the kind of position that I would advocate at the moment.
Peter, concluding statement?
One of the reasons there's so much turmoil across the world, Brexit was an example of that, Donald Trump's election was an example of that, and there are others as well, at least in the industrially advanced world, the richer world, is that the middle of society has been losing out over the last few decades under a neoliberal economic system. And that's very dangerous politically. We saw it in the most extreme form under the Weimar Republic, which led to Nazi Germany when inflation got out of control and so on. And without going into the history of all of that, if you damage the prospects of the middle of society, the great bulk of citizens, you are going to create political turmoil. You have to get back to a system of economic governance and a balance of taxation to fund fundamental provision, but also to support the growth, and it'll be low carbon, zero carbon, green growth for the future, or it won't be growth at all, that you have to have government working in tandem with the private sector. And yes, there will be a continual debate between Stephen and I and between left and right as to where that balance strikes, where you strike that balance. But unless you have a strong public sector, and Stephen says the state hasn't been shrunk in Britain over the last 10, 11 years. There have been massive cuts of up to 30% in most local government municipal budgets at great damage to the social fabric of local communities. And that obsession with shrinking the state is, I think, entirely the wrong thing. Equally, managing everything from the center is entirely wrong as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, gentlemen. This has been a very fascinating conversation, and I'm not afraid to admit it, but in some parts I was out of my depth, especially when it comes to UK housing, but still, it was absolutely fascinating. And to our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and this has been WorldView.